Professor Francione, thank you so much for making time for this. I'm really excited. I was thinking about doing this in a few months, but thankfully we were able to find the time and place to do this now. So thank you for accepting my invitation. How's everything going?
Oh, it's fine, except the fact that we're having a worldwide heat wave, and it's a disaster, and it's going to get worse. But apart from that, everything's just fine.
Yeah, apart from that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. I wanted to ask you, for the listeners or people who are watching this who haven't heard of your work yet, could you please give us a quick background information?
Well, it's been going on for a few decades, so it's hard to encapsulate. But basically, my work is focused on a critique of animal welfare, a focus on the implications of the property status of animals, um, a rights theory based on one right, the right not to be property, and a right of and a theory of non-human personhood, which is linked to one characteristic, that is sentience. I don't require any more cognitive sophistication. I don't require self-awareness and things like that. And then that is one of the ways in which my work differs from, say, Singer's or even Tom Reagan's. And so, it's a focus on non-human personhood based on sentience alone. If you're sentient, then you've got everything you need for to be a non-human person. And by when I say non-human person, what I mean is someone who has morally significant interest in continuing to live. They have an interest in their life. Um, and I focused a lot over the years because, in addition to philosophy, going to graduate school in philosophy, I also have a law degree, and I focused a lot on property over the years and the problems of animals as property. And it what where we are basically in terms of our thinking and where we've been for the past several hundred years is this idea that we don't think that animals are persons. We don't think that they have a morally significant interest in continuing to live. And that's in part because we think that they're not self-aware, so that they don't really care if we kill them as long as we kill them painlessly. And but they have an interest in not suffering, but they don't have an interest in continuing to live. So they're not persons, because persons are beings who have a morally significant interest in continuing to live. They've got to um, say it informally, sort of a right to life. We don't think of animals as having that. We think of these are beings that we use and we kill, and they have a morally significant interest in not suffering. The problem is, because they're property, and this is really important, because they're chattel property, they only have an economic value, an extrinsic external economic value. And so it costs money for us to protect their interests in not suffering. And because they are economic commodities, the more money we spend on protecting their interests, the more expensive they become. And when you have, you've got um, markets, both national and regional and international now. Um, Price differences have tremendous impacts, and so people are trying to keep the cost down as much as possible. And the position I argue is that because animals are property, we will generally protect their interests only to the extent that it's economically efficient to do so.
Yeah.
And so we'll purchase protection for their interests to the extent that not doing so will cost us more money. So, for example, many countries have laws which require that larger animals be stunned before they're shackled, hoisted, and cut. Why? Because if you don't do that and you've got an animal hanging upside down and the animal's panicked and moving around a lot, the animal will incur carcass damage and will cause worker injuries. These things have economic
Yeah.
impact. And so we basically purchase protection that is economically efficient, but the result of that is the standards of animal welfare are very low. And so, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think animal welfare is a really bad idea. I mean, there's several reasons, but one of them is, as a practical matter, it doesn't work. It can't work.
Yeah.
The standard's always going to be very, very, very low. And so I focus on that, and I focus on, I am critical, and I admit I'm critical of these of corporate animal charities, because I think in many ways the sort of activism that they promote is an activism that is intended to keep the donor base as broad as possible, but I don't think that that really does very much.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I definitely agree. I think one of the main reasons is because a lot of the financial support that enters the movement comes from the effective altruism group, and they are heavily utilitarian-based groups and donors. So I think they just want to see numbers and not really, I assume, it's all about numbers and showing results in numbers, but then that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to help on the long term. I wanted to ask you. Sorry, go ahead.
It's interesting that you talk about effective altruism because I, in this manila envelope, I've just finished doing a review for Oxford for a book that has been edited by Carol Adams and Alice
Yeah.
Murray and Ray Gruen called Effective Altruism
The good it promises and the harm it does.
Promises That Harm Can. I've just done a review of that.
All right.
And what I could say a lot, I won't, but the bottom line, I mean, it effective altruism is I mean, it's not coincidental that Peter Singer
Yes.
is is prominent in both sort of the non-rights welfarist community and in
Mm.
the effective altruism community. I mean, he's quite significant in both communities. And so the fact that effective altruism focuses on the sorts of campaigns that Peter thinks are efficient, and well, that's no surprise
Yeah.
because this is all, look, the movement that we have is it's Peter Singer's movement. I used to have this discussion with Reagan all the time. Whether or not he liked it, I liked it, or anybody else liked it, the reality is it's Peter Singer's movement. It has been for a long time for lots of different reasons, but it's been his movement, and it is his movement, and it's a movement that sort of focuses on these utilitarian ideas, and that rejects the idea that animals. I mean, one of Singer's main points, which he picks up from Bentham, is that animals have an interest in not suffering, but they don't have an interest in continuing to live. Bentham said this, back when he wrote Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, and said the question is, not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? That's the
Suffer.
important point. And but Bentham thought that the fact that animals were not cognitively sophisticated was irrelevant to their suffering. They could suffer. That's all that mattered. However, Bentham thought that their inability to think or reason or use abstract thinking, whatever, their cognitive sophistication was relevant to whether or not they had an interest in continuing to live. And so Bentham says basically the cow doesn't care that we kill and eat her. She just cares about how we treat her and how we slaughter her. That's all. And so and Peter picks that up. I mean that's Singer just takes that from Bentham and basically says, the only difference between Singer and Bentham is Singer thinks that some animals may be self-aware, although he's not really sure which animals are self-aware. And he equivocates all over the place on that, and he depends on what day you're talking to him actually as to which animals he thinks count. But that's the difference between Singer and Bentham, is that Bentham thought that animals were not self-aware. Singer thinks some animals, like the great apes,
Yeah.
the non-human great apes, are self-aware. He thinks elephants are. He thinks some marine mammals are. And then he says the other ones, it's a question of whether you give them the benefit of the doubt. Well, if you're in that situation, then you're not talking about any sort of moral rules. And then he also says that even if they're self-aware, they're not self-aware in the same way that humans are. They have a lesser degree of self-aware. I just think this is all problematic in lots of different ways. And
Yeah.
and what's sort of interesting, Sam, is that Tom, even though even though Tom Reagan disagreed with Singer on the structure, the utilitarian, Reagan was a rights theorist and Singer's a utilitarian. Tom was also into this idea that subjects of a life are those that have a psychophysical sense of identity. And so there was this idea of cognitive sophistication. Tom didn't think, I mean, he equivocates in the case for animal rights. He says, well, I'm not really going to get into it, but he basically says that he finds it very difficult to understand how a merely sentient being can be the subject of a life. He doesn't say they can't be. He just
Yeah.
says that he has a hard time understanding how they could be. And my view is that these people are all functioning with this enlightenment idea that human beings are different from the human animals are different from non-human animals because we have cognitive sophistication that they lack. And we keep on going back to this anthropocentric speciesist position that if they don't have similar minds to ours, and this is what I call the similar minds theory, if they don't have minds that are similar, then they may have morally significant interests, but they don't have a morally significant interest in continuing to live. And so therefore we may still use them in institutional exploitation. The problem is once you say that, then you know then you're back to animal welfare, you're back to the property status of animals, and the level of protection is always going to be very low. I mean,
Yeah.
we could protect more animal interests, it's just going to make animal products more expensive,
Yeah.
and there's a sense in which a lot of animal welfare people say, well, yeah, let's make it more expensive. Well, that's easy for them to say because a lot of them they'll still be able to afford it, and so what they're basically saying is, well, as long as we can afford it, we'll purchase more protection. I think this is just the wrong way to look at things. I mean, I think we
Yeah.
ought to, if animals matter morally. I mean, this is the argument I make in my most recent book, Why Veganism Matters: The Moral Value of Animals, is basically you say, look, if animals matter morally, we cannot use them as commodities. If we cannot use them as commodities and institutionalized exploitation can't be justified, that's the end of it. This is not like rocket science. It's really quite
Logic.
it's logic. It's
Yeah.
actually very logical. So
Yeah.
that's sort of what the sorts of things I think about.
Yeah. And going back, I mean, it has been a few decades. How did you actually first come across animal rights, and when exactly did you decide to go vegan and then dive into it as well?
It's actually sort of a funny story. I became a vegetarian in, I don't know, 76, 77, back then. I went to a slaughterhouse and it upset me and I stopped eating meat. And and then I ate fish for like I think another year, and then I read something about fish being sentient and whatnot. And so I stopped eating fish. And in 82, wait a minute, 82, 1982, the fall of 1982, I was in Washington, D.C., and I was clerking for um, a Supreme Court justice, United States Supreme Court, for the first woman on our Supreme Court, a woman named Sandra O'Connor. And a dog was hit by the Supreme Court, and I went and I picked the dog. The dog was still alive, and I picked the dog up and brought the dog back in the court. And I called the Washington Humane Society, and they sent over one of their agents to get the dog who died while I was waiting for her to come. And that person was Ingrid Newkirk.
Oh.
And she came into my office and the dog was dead. And we talked for a few minutes and she said, you ought to think about becoming a vegetarian. And I said, well, I am a vegetarian. And and she said, for moral reasons. And I said, yes. And then she told me that she had just started a group with her then boyfriend, a guy named Alex Pacheco, that they had just started a group called People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And I said, well, why don't you come over on Friday night and let's talk? Because I don't really know anything about this animal rights stuff. And she and Alex came over for dinner. And Ingrid saw that I wasn't eating meat, but I used to eat a tremendous. I lived on ice cream,
Yeah.
and I ate really, it's amazing I've lived this long. But ate a huge amount of ice cream and eggs. I mean, I used to eat a lot of, I mean, and I'd never heard the word. This was 1982. I'd never heard the word vegan. I did not know what a vegan was.
Hmm.
And I thought you couldn't live without eating animal products. So and we stayed up all night. It was a Friday night in October of 1982, and we stayed up all night and talking about veganism, and that was it. I have not eaten an animal product since October of 1982. I mean, it wasn't a transition; it just ended, um, and um, and that's how I became a vegan, and that's how I got involved. I mean, I hadn't really thought about the issue philosophically up to that point, really. It was when I met them, and then I started, when I finished my clerkship, I started doing legal work for them,
Mm.
and and uh, and my partner, who had not yet gone, she's also a lawyer, but she had not yet gone to law school, and she was editing. I was basically their first lawyer, and my partner was the first editor of their newsletter, and the PETA newsletter, and that's how I got involved with it. And then I started. I was practicing for a while in New York City, and then I went to teach at the University of Pennsylvania, and got involved with some projects, animal projects that were going on at the time, and then I met Tom Reagan
Mm.
in I guess it was the spring of '85. I think, I don't remember. I think it was the spring of '85, and I met Tom, and then we started working together, and that's how it started. That's how it
Wow.
developed.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a lot of. I mean, it was interesting stuff, because when we were really, there are no roadmaps in outer space, and so when I first met Tom, we didn't really understand what we didn't understand what animal rights meant as a practical matter.
Mm.
In other words, how do you translate animal rights into practical campaigns and whatnot? And what was becoming clear was that nobody else knew either. And what was happening was, as the 80s went on, the groups were just sort of falling back into sort of welfarism. So they were doing sort of the classical welfare stuff,
Yeah.
but with more radical edge, and it was sort of like, well, we're vegans, but we're doing the same campaigns that the Humane Society of the United States is doing. I mean, it was confused.
Mm.
And so Tom didn't really know, and I didn't really understand. I mean, nobody really did understand what animal rights meant in practice.
Yeah.
So Reagan and I spent a huge amount of time, working on trying to come up with a model of what animal rights meant. And what we came up with was, in the early '90s, was this idea that, well, we were going to promote veganism, and we're not going to support welfare reform, and we're going to talk about the relationship between human rights and non-human rights, et cetera, and that sort of stuff. We came up with this model, and which we then brought to the movement. And Tom and I spent a lot of time going from conference to, because at the time it was before the internet, right? I mean, I know it's hard for you young people to sort of recognize there was a time in which this didn't exist.
I remember that.
Okay, well,
I'm not that young, but yes.
All right. You just look young. You're a vegan. You're healthy. So we'd go for, there were conferences. That's how one talked to other actors, was through a conference. And so we would go to these conferences, and we would talk about, what more welfarism and the problem with single issue campaigns and blah, 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 and stuff that Tom and I, spent a lot of time working on and developing. And then we quickly found out that the movement didn't like this approach, because the movement was a business. And so it was sort of funny, because Tom and I were both academics. So we both had we both were getting paid by universities. We were professors in universities. We were not employees of organizations. And I don't think either of us really quite appreciated how much these things were businesses.
Mm.
And, I mean, it was not, I mean, in certain ways, I feel sort of, I feel that I wasn't savvy enough, because it was, I mean, as PETA got larger and larger, it was getting more and more, watered down and more sort of more welfareist, and we would have these arguments about the sexism, and I'd rather go naked than refer, and all that's not nonsense and stuff. And but it really wasn't clear to me until later in the 90s how much of a business this thing is. And people are making a huge amount of money. I mean, these organizations bring in a lot of money.
Mm.
And and people say, well, I don't get a big salary. Well, some of them do and some of them don't. But the ones that don't, I mean, basically they every meal that they have is paid for, is reimbursed, and basically so it's a business, and I don't think we should ever forget that it's a business. I mean, and these people are careerists. They're making money. I mean, they're making a living off of this. And I didn't really appreciate that. I don't think Tom did either. And so, later on in the 90s, things started getting hot, because Reagan and I were really, it was the Tom and Gary show. We were going all over the place doing rights versus welfare, and, blah, blah, blah. And people started getting really angry and didn't want us to do that. And it got a little hot. And Tom and I had different personalities. Tom, I think the best way to put it is Tom really cared about being liked.
Mm.
That was less of a concern for me. And so Tom responded more to the, there was some events that happened. I actually wrote about this when Tom died. Between the Species did a special issue dedicated to him, and I had the lead article, and it was an article about how the animal rights movement fell apart. And I talk about what happened, and there were some specific events, and Tom and I would not support them, and people got very angry, and it ended up Tom ended up, it was focused on the Second March for the Animals in Washington, which happened in 1996. And we initially took the position we weren't going to support it, and then Tom took the position he was going to support it, and then he and I fell apart.
Yeah.
I mean, there were some other issues as well, but basically, and then he ended up spending the rest of his life writing this stuff that I to me, it's incomprehensible. I mean, he was trying to sort of play it both sides. He was trying to say, well, he's a rights activist, but it's a big tent. And the answer is no, it can't be a big tent. If it's a rights movement, there's a reason why when it came to human slavery, you had abolitionists and regulationists, and they didn't get along very well.
Yeah.
Because they had a fundamentally, and Tom understood that, and then he didn't, and he sort of took a different position and thought, well, we can all get along. And the answer is, well, I don't wish anybody harm. And I like a lot of these people who are welfare. I mean, they were my friends, but I disagreed with them. And I think that was the main sort of thing, was that, but it was interesting, because if it weren't for the internet, I mean, basically I wrote Rain Without Thunder in 1996, and everybody stopped talking to me. I was like I was a pariah. And the interesting thing about the book is I didn't really even get into personal stuff. I mean, I didn't talk about a lot of stuff I could have talked about, which I didn't. I just talked about ideological stuff, about how welfareism was problematic, and how welfareism was basically making the line between the animal exploiters and the animal people very, very difficult to draw. And you had animal people who were saying things that industry could go along with, and you had industry saying things that animal people could go along with. And when you have that situation, you got trouble.
Yeah.
And so and so I wrote that book in '96, and everybody stopped talking to me. As a matter of fact, I was told in no uncertain terms, there used to be a big conference called the National Alliance. I think it was called the National Alliance. It was like the big conference that they used to have before Alex Hershaft and Farm took over with the National Animal Rights Convention, or whatever the hell it's called. It has nothing to do with animal rights, but the conference that had preceded Hershaft's big conference, the guy who was running that basically told me, he said, "You'll never speak at another event." When Rain Without Thunder came out, he said, "You'll never speak at another animal event again." And I said, "Okay, that's fine." What happened? I said, "I'm not, that's fine. I'll take that hit. I have to take that hit." And so I basically went and I continued doing writing. I developed a theory which became Introduction to Animal Rights, which I published in 2000. And it took me 3 or 4 years to sort of write that, to get it right. And I was just doing my stuff and mostly doing like sort of lectures at universities and stuff, but I was basically out of the movement. And it was only in the early 2000s when a guy who was then working at Apple Computer, a fellow named Randy Sandberg, and he started calling me saying, "You've got to get on the internet, and you've got to," I said, "No, I don't want to have anything to do with that stuff. I just don't like that stuff," and blah, blah, blah. And he drove me crazy. I mean, he called me endlessly and told me that I had this moral obligation to do this because, this was the way of the future. And I said, "Well, fine, but I and then eventually I said to him, "Okay, I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. I'll write the content, but I don't want to have anything to do with the computers and the technology. You do it, you handle it." And he did. And we started the Abolitionist Approach website, the Abolitionist Approach to Animal Rights, and it went crazy. I mean, it took off. It got thousands of people, and it started a grassroots movement. And the thing is that when I first got involved in the movement in the early '80s, PETA had chapters. They had chapters all over the country. Because it was their theory, their philosophy was, you've got to have a grassroots movement. As they became larger and larger and richer, that stopped. That stopped right quick. And they got rid of that. They got rid of all of their chapters. They actually did that fairly early, but they basically, this whole grassroots idea, just went out the window, and it became a all of these groups, they're corporations. They may be nonprofit corporations, but they're corporations. They're businesses. And they've got to keep their donor base broad. So they have all these welfare campaigns because you don't have, if you show up and you like animals, but you're not a vegan, and you say, well, I want to be an animal person. Well, that's fine. You're not a vegan, that's fine, but you can donate to us, and if you're a vegan, you could. And also the other thing that they do is they do these single issue campaigns which the economic model for a single issue campaign is, you get people together, most of whom will be involved in animal exploitation in some way, and you get them to point their finger at somebody else. I mean, in other words, so you get a bunch of people who aren't vegan, but they say, well, look at those Chinese or those Koreans, they're eating dogs, they're horrible people. Or the people at these people are beating dolphins at Tai Chi or whatever, or women wearing fur. I mean, this was a big issue. I mean, it was like these single issue campaigns always tended to focus on marginalized groups of some sort, whether they were women wearing fur or whether they were, there was always, most of these single issue campaigns do focus on marginalized groups, or they're ethnocentric and xenophobic, and they're sort of like pointing fingers at foreigners, which we love to do. But I mean, again, that works financially, because what you do is you get a bunch of people together and they say, well, I eat steak, I eat fish, I eat chicken, I eat dairy, but those Oriental people, those Asian people, they eat dogs, and it's like, it's really xenophobic. It's really, it's really, I mean, I find the lack of progressive politics in the movement to be shocking. I have to tell these people all the time. I mean, whenever I'm talking to people about like dog eating in Asia, you have to tell them, carpets are Oriental, human beings are not Oriental. It's like always, well, these Oriental people, they're horrible people. And it's like, wow. A lot of these things like these live export campaigns, it's
Mm.
like, oh, well, if you send the animals to, like there's been an issue with Palestine. If you have live exports and they go to Palestine, these Palestinians are really, they're horrible people and they'll torture the animals and stuff. Well, like, it's not that the animals are having a grand old time, wherever they are exported from,
Yeah.
and it's but again, it allows you to point your finger at somebody else and say, well, we're good people, we slaughter them humanely, but those Palestinians are really, they're barbarians, and that
Mm.
sort of into all sorts of problematic. But the movement has been reactionary. It's like it always has been. I mean, it's a right. Unfortunately, it's a pretty right wing entity, and it's I some well the I had about 2 years ago. There's a group called Anonymous for the Voiceless.
Yeah.
You're from, and I got they're the guy who, his name escapes me, but he's the guy who started the group.
Paul Bashir.
Yes.
Yeah.
He said something about how he would use prisoners in experiments and not animals. And I said, well, wait a minute. I said, said the problem with that is when you say that to me, 70% of that prison population in the United States is black. And they're
Mm.
there for the stupid crime of, most of them are for in connection with drug issues. And so when you say, well, we should be using prisoners in experiments, what I'm hearing is we should be using black people in experiments. And I had some major problems with them because when we have a serious problem here I mean, racism exists all over the world, but we have a real problem here with police engaging in violent conduct against minority people. And so when the the whole Floyd incident happened, when that guy got choked or asphyxiated, and I was saying, well, we all ought to, take the position. It's not a question. It's not that I want animal people to become civil rights people, but I think we ought to be taking the position that all of this is really bad. And I started getting a lot of pushback and people saying, well, how can you support Black Lives Matter when they have marches, they have pig heads and things
Yeah.
like that to symbolize the police. And I said, look, I disagree with that. I don't think they should do that, but that doesn't mean because they're speciesist, that doesn't mean I'm not going to support efforts to get rid of racism, because as far
Yes.
as I'm concerned, it's all the stuff anyway.
Mm.
And but the movement, again, the movement is very apolitical because you want to, a lot of those people who contribute to the movement are conservatives. They're right-wing people. And, a lot of people who like dogs and cats and horses and stuff like that, they have a lot of money and they're not particularly progressive. And so you want to keep the donor base. And I actually saw that a lot in the 90s. I was always being asked to sort of tone down my political stuff because I had been writing stuff about the relationship between left-wing thinking and animal issues.
Yeah.
And that was something that really interested me a lot back then. But I was always being told, don't get into that stuff when you're giving a talk because, it upsets people, because we have a lot, and I always thought, well, I don't really care whether it upsets people. I mean, I'm going to say what I'm going to say. It is what it is, but it's a problematic movement, but it's a corporate movement. Don't kid yourself. It's a corporate movement. These organizations make a huge amount of money, absolutely huge amount of money. These are multi-million-dollar operations, and kid yourself not, they're big businesses.
All right. So there's a lot of things I want to get into. We'll get into them one by one. So I do want to talk about single issue campaigns. We'll get into that in a bit. And I want to talk about welfarism and abolitionist approach. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you, when you mentioned in the beginning that the only, I assume, the only factor that we should take into consideration before granting basic moral rights to an individual is sentience. Do you believe there's also a sentience hierarchy?
No.
All right.
Like pregnancy, you're either sentient or you're not. I mean,
Okay.
no, I don't. I think that's a category mistake. to
Okay.
talk about degrees. Sentience can be different.
Mm,
I mean, there's no doubt. We have five rescue dogs that we live with. Um, Cognitively, we're not the same animals. I mean,
mm,
but they're sentient. I'm sentient. Um, they're sentient. Actually, they're subjectively aware in ways that I'm not.
mm.
They can, tell they can go back to a bush that they've urinated on 2 months before and be able to recognize that I can't do that. So I mean, I don't agree. I don't believe. I mean, I don't believe at all in these ideas about that. There's differences of sentience. I mean, if you are sentient, you are subjectively aware.
Mm.
Just as you could, to the extent that you say that there are differences of sentience, you have to say that with human beings as well. You
Okay.
have to say, well, I mean, you can have one of the arguments I make is that if you're somebody who's got severe dementia and you can't think, a minute into the future or a minute into the past, that person has a different mind from the mind that I have, because at least at this point in time, I can still think ahead and I can still remember somewhat. Um, but uh, but are we gonna say, well, you've got a higher level of sentience. If you well, the example I give in my book, my most recent book, is I say, what if you've got two people who have dementia? One is able to plan several minutes into the future and remember several minutes into the past. The other one can't. The other one is stuck in the
Mm,
eternal present. They have different sorts of sentience, but we would not. And there are people like that. I mean, there are people who are human beings who have severe dementia and they are incapable. They live in an eternal present. They can't remember anything that happened
mm,
10 seconds ago, and they can't plan 10 seconds in the future. And then there are people who have severe dementia, but not quite as severe, who can plan, into the future and can remember into the past. Now, are those different levels of sentience? Well, they're different. Excuse me, there's different cognitive levels there.
mm.
But that doesn't mean that, I mean, they're both persons in that they both have an interest in continuing to live, and they're both connected to a future self, even if that future self is the future self in the next second of consciousness.
Yeah.
So, and that's my argument in the book, is that as long as they're sentient, you have a connection. Even if you have no ability beyond the next second, you're still connected to yourself in the next second. That is what it means to be sentient, and you have an interest in continuing your life into that next second, into that next second, into that next second. And so I don't believe, I know it's a popular notion because I get this all
Mm.
the time. People, aren't there degrees of sentience? And the answer is there are different types of sentience, but any level of sentience gives you, gives you all you need for
Mm.
non-human, for personhood, whether you're a human or non-human.
Yeah. So the reason why I'm asking this is because I was thinking about this hypothetical situation. I really like hypothetical questions just to test consistency and try to figure out new things. So let's say hypothetical situation. You're driving on the road. Let's say you're on a bicycle. You're riding your bicycle. You're accidentally going to hit either a dog or go over an ant or another insect. I personally would, in this hypothetical situation, go over the insect. And my reasoning for that would be the assumption that the insect would not suffer, or let's say there's something about the insect that makes me assume that it's less bad that I hit the insect rather than the dog. And I can't really put that into words because I don't have the science to explain it. I'm personally not like that educated about the scientific information about it. But what would you do in that hypothetical situation, and how would you justify that, let's say?
I don't walk on grass because I don't want to kill
Mm.
insects.
Yeah.
I mean, to the extent that I can avoid it, I do it. When I'm walking, I'm always looking to make sure, when I'm walking my dogs and stuff, I'm always looking to try to avoid stepping on ants. If I find ants or spiders or whatever in my house, I don't kill them. I don't know whether they're sentient. I really don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know whether there's sort of a nociception there or whether there's actually sentience. I just don't know. I don't
Mm.
think anybody else does either. Um, Now, there are logical explanations for your intuition, which is, if you have a choice of running over an ant, or you have no choice. You either got to run over
Yeah.
the ant or you run over the dog. Um, you're more likely to kill the ant quickly than you are the dog.
Mm.
So right off the bat, there's nothing mysterious about it. I mean, you're going to, assuming that the ant is sentient, which I don't know, you're going to cause the ant a lot less suffering than you're going to cause the dog. So that might in itself be a reason, but that's not a question of, I mean, let's assume that the ant is sentient.
Mm.
Let's assume that the ant is sentient, because we don't know, but assuming that the ant is sentient, then I would say we should not exploit either, the ant or the dog. But there could be logical reasons why, if you were in a situation where you had to kill one or the other, you would say, well, killing the ant is going to be very quick. I'm going to be able to do this and do it quickly, and there'll be a minimum of pain. Whereas with a dog, there's going to be more pain, there's going to be more trauma. So just on that ground alone, you can distinguish those situations. But I think I also think that, because I get this is what you're getting into, or at least I don't know whether you're getting into it, but certainly related ideas. I get this all the time. It's like, well, but vegans are responsible for animals dying in crop production,
Oh, yeah.
or I had a very bizarre discussion with this fellow who started this reducitarian nonsense, and he and I were going back and forth on Twitter. I don't remember Brian Cateman, I think is his name. And he was saying, well, you can't really be perfect about this, because when you walk outside, you're stepping on insects. And I said, well, I try to avoid doing that. But I said, I agree that happens. But that's like saying that if I build a road, I know that some human beings are going to be killed on the road, because if you have a road, depending on how many lanes the road has and how fast, what the speed limit is, you can get a statistician called an actuarial who will tell you how many accidents there will be at 60 miles an hour, 70 miles an hour, etc. And so when we build a road, we know that there will be incidental and unintended deaths. But that doesn't mean that those unintended and incidental deaths are the same as murdering those people. I mean, we still draw a line,
Yeah.
and so I think, but I don't make distinctions about sentience. I mean, certainly a more difficult hypothetical is, I mean, a lot of people, for some reason, which I don't understand, a lot of people think that birds are less sentient than mammals. They're different. They're sentient in a different way, but they're clearly sentient. And so there are a lot of people who say, well, I would choose to kill a bird before I would kill a mammal. And so why? Why? And because there, I think, because there it's going to be difficult to, you're going to cause a lot of suffering to both the bird and to the, to the so that one I think is rather difficult. It's a lot more difficult, and I probably would flip a coin if I had no choice. I mean, it's sort of like people say, I mean, the book I wrote in 2000 was called Introduction to Animal Rights, Your Child or the Dog. And the reason why there was this subtitle was, people would always say, well, if you were going by a burning house, and there was a child and a dog,
Yeah.
who would save? And the answer is, I'd save whoever I got to first. But the bottom line is that, the fact that I might save the child because I understand what death is to a human being, but I don't really understand what death is. I know death is bad for a dog, but I don't really understand what it means. So I'm epistemologically limited. I might save the human, but that doesn't mean that I think the human is worth more. It just means I
Yeah.
understand more. I have more information to make my moral decision.
Yeah. Thank you. Um, for me, this has been a difficult one. I mean, I don't really think about the crop deaths thing as an argument, because that's just a nirvana fallacy. Like, yeah, as long as you're like, you can't really get the best out of everything and make the world in a way where no one is suffering no matter what you're doing. Because let's face it, as long as you're alive, you're causing some amount of suffering. in one way or another. So the next thing I want to talk about, you mentioned earlier, single issue campaigns. I'm personally I've read about it, so I know about what it means. But for those who are hearing this term single issue campaign for the first time, can you please explain it and also explain your stance on it, of course?
Yeah, a single issue campaign is you identify some practice like, or some wearing animals for fur, or eating dogs in Korea or whatever. And you focus on these, or carriage horses, the use of carriage horses. And you focus on these what we call single issue campaigns, where you're focusing on a particular sort of treatment or use, and you target that as problematic. And the reason why and actually these things are the bread and butter, the bread and vegan butter of the, I hope vegan, of the movement, because they're great fundraising vehicles. And the problem I have with them is that I believe they, like welfare campaigns, tend to actually encourage exploitation, because with welfare campaigns, we're supposedly trying to make animal use more humane, which, as I said before, when I was talking about the property status of animals, is going to be a limit. I mean, what's humane? How do you define humane? And humane is always going to be limited by economic. It's always going to be limited economically. And so what you do with welfare campaigns is you encourage people to believe that there's a right way to do the wrong thing, and they can continue to exploit animals as long as they're willing to buy happy, cage-free eggs or crate-free pork or some nonsense like that. And that's a problem. It's a big problem. But similarly, when you have these single issue campaigns, one that I was involved with some years ago was we got, actually it happened when it got up a lot of steam when the French would not support the invasion of Iraq. And so people here started talking about, well, they were going to go after foie gras, the product, the goose liver, where they force feed the goose and the liver ruptures and stuff. And this is something that a lot of French people like and stuff. So this was like French food. So we could go after it because we hated the French because they would not support our ambitions in the Middle East. And I remember having arguments with people about this, because I said, there's no difference between foie gras and steak. I mean, it's like all the same. I mean, this idea that, well, you're pointing your finger at foie gras and saying that that's, who the hell eats that anyway? I mean, it's not that this is a popular food here. And number one, and number two, it sort of suggests that there's some animal products which are worse than other animal products, and it's bad to eat those things, but by implication, it's okay to eat what the better products. So you have people saying, well, foie gras is bad, but I eat hamburgers, but of course they're a whole lot better. And the answer is, I think that this encourages a lot of confused thinking. And and that's why I mean, look, I understand that people think that my ideas about veganism are utopian. I think they're incredibly, I mean, I'm a very practical person. And the bottom line is, we ain't never going to change this without a big vegan movement. We could change this. I remember in 1985, we had a big meeting in Washington, and the issue was there was certain animal welfare legislation that people wanted other people to support. And I remember being in that meeting and saying, I wouldn't waste a second with this nonsense. And they said, well, what would you do? And I said, I'd spend every cent and every minute of energy and every cent of resources on turning people on veganism. And they said, well, that's not practical. I said, no, that's the only thing that is practical, because that's the only thing that's going to really change things. And had we put it, when you think about all the money, and we're talking billions of dollars, I mean, the animal movement is big business. And when you think about all of the money that's been spent on animal campaigns since the mid 1980s, it's been a lot of money. You took all that money and you put it into vegan, education campaigns where, you stop this bullshitting around. It's a podcast, right? So I can use,
yeah, it's fine.
I can say bullshit. And stop this bullshitting around. and really sort of go for veganism, we would have a big vegan movement right now. We don't
Mm.
in large part because we've got a big happy exploitation movement. This is what I mean when I say this is Singer's movement. In 2005 something really important happened, and that was um, Singer got all of the big groups in the United States and some in Britain to go along and support him in his efforts to he was praising. There's a chain of high-end food markets here called Whole Foods.
Mm.
These are very expensive. These are very, very expensive stores, and they sell a lot of happy meat and stuff like that. And in Singer, they were coming out with a campaign to come out with standards for the Animal Compassion Campaign or some nonsense like that. And Singer put out this public statement with all the groups: PETA, Mercy for Animals, In Defense of Animals, all of these groups, Compassion Over Killing, all these big groups, Viva, um, basically praising this happy exploitation thing. This inaugurated sort of the modern happy exploitation movement. It had been going on before in terms of the welfare movement, but this got it really going.
Mm.
And this was at about the same time, people are starting to think about what's effective. All true, what's effective in terms of what we do. And so, what was determined to be effective by Singer and people who supported Singer was that, what was effective was getting these large corporations to sort of change their standards. Um, and reasonable minds can differ, but I think the evidence is pretty clear is that, these supposedly happy exploitation places aren't a hell of a lot better, and in some cases are indistinguishable from the conventional exploitation places. And so I think that um, you know, what we need is a vegan movement. And
Mm.
things are never going to change until we have a vegan movement. We don't have one. I mean, that's the problem. And when um, and I've debated animal people from some of these groups, and they say, well, it hasn't worked. We don't have a vegan movement because people are just don't want. I said, we've never had a vegan movement. We've never
Mm.
had a sustained effort, where we speak with one voice, and that is veganism is a moral imperative. It's a moral baseline. Whatever else we owe animals, we owe this to them as a bare minimum, and we have a moral obligation to do this, and that's the end of the story. We don't do that.
Mm.
We've got these people who are, what are I forget what Melanie Joy has got some operation where she's, these
Uh,
people go.
Beyond Carnism and Pro-Veg, I believe.
Yeah. But they're basically saying, well, it's okay if you're not a vegan. It's because you're being, it's because the mechanism of exploitation is invisible to you. No, it's not invisible. Everybody knows what it is. It's a welfarist mentality.
Mm.
And it's this idea that it's all right for us to exploit them because they matter less than we do morally. And so you've got all these people. I mean, you've got all these organizations all promoting everything but veganism is a moral imperative. So my view is like, until we do that, nothing's ever going to change. And what we're going to have is, another like zillion trillion years of, we've had animal welfare for 200 and some odd years now. I mean, it's like, this is not an idea that started last week. I mean,
Yeah.
it started in Britain in the 19th century, and we're exploiting more animals now than at any point in human history. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work as a practical thing, practical matter. And so, and we're never going to get there by having anti-fur campaign. I mean, think about it for a second. It's like the fur camp. I mean, when I first got involved with this 8 million years ago, the anti-fur campaign was the big thing. And I sort of, I got when I got involved, I was, and when I was a young lawyer, I used to go to these demonstrations. People have these anti-fur demonstrations, and I would go and make sure that they didn't get arrested and stuff like that. And it became very clear to me that there was something very wrong and very confused, because I'd go to a demonstration, in the middle of New York City, and there'd be a bunch of people there wearing wool coats and leather shoes, calling women vulgar names because they were wearing fur coats. And I said, wait a minute now, I mean, I stopped wearing leather when I became a vegan. I stopped
Yeah.
wearing, and when I first became a vegan, we didn't have enough. I mean, I didn't have enough money to sort of like throw all my clothes away. But but then as I was able to do it, I did get rid of my clothes, and I stopped wearing any animal products. But it was clear to me right from the beginning that there's no really morally significant different distinction between fur and leather and wool. I mean, leather is just skin with the hair off of it, and fur is skin with the hair on it. And so I couldn't understand what the hell the difference was, and I still don't understand what the difference is. So I can't. I mean, to me, the anti-fur campaign is nonsense, and it functions. It works because I live in a patriarchal, sexist world where people look for any excuse they can to sort of say, to victimize women and go and yell and scream at women. And so, that's why that campaign works, but it doesn't work because there's any ideology there that is sound. It's not. And
Yeah.
so, this is the thing. All this stuff is nonsense and it's a distraction. There's one thing that matters: veganism. And what I find is I try to spend as little time as possible talking to animal people because it's like talking to a wall. You're talking to people. You're talking to people who are indoctrinated with these these corporate charities, and it's like talking to the wall, literally. I'd rather go and talk to groups of people who are not animal people, who are interested but not animal people, and because I can get them to understand this pretty quickly. This is not, again, this is it's and I get a fairly decent reaction when I do these things. I'll go into a room of 300 students in a college, and there's not an animal rights thing, it's just a university lecture, and I'll ask them, how many of you know who Michael Vick is? All their hands will go up. Michael Vick was an American football player, and he got in trouble because he was running a dogfighting ring in Virginia, and he went to jail for tax evasion or whatever the hell he went to jail for. But he got in trouble for his dogfighting operation, and he still excoriated people. Still, when he shows up in a public place, there's still demonstrations against him. People still, and I always say, y'all know who Michael Vick is? Yeah. Bad guy? Yeah, he's a bad guy. Why is he a bad guy? Well, because he was killing those dogs. I don't know. We kill dogs. We kill dogs in experiments. Yeah, but he was doing it for fun. Oh, wait a minute. So are you telling me that the problem is that he didn't have a good reason to impose the suffering and death on dogs? No, he didn't have a good reason. I said, but he enjoyed it. Well, enjoyment's not enough. And I said, okay, fine. It takes me about 90 seconds to get to that point. And then I say to the 300 kids who are sitting there, okay, how many of y'all are vegan? And then, if a few hands go up, I say, how about the rest of you? Y'all just said that what Michael Vick did was wrong because he couldn't justify what he did, because enjoying killing the dogs and getting pleasure from it is not enough. But isn't that the only justification we have when we're eating animals, is that we like to taste? That's all. And you'd be surprised. Most people have never really had it explained to them that way. And then when you explain it that way, boom, they get it. And so, I keep doing this. I don't have to do, I don't actually charge money to do these things. If I get paid money, I give the money to a student group or something like that. I don't take money to do this. But I don't do this, A, to make money, and B, I don't have to do it. I'm tenured. I'm a board of governors professor at the university. I can't go any higher. And I don't do this. I do this because it works. I do this because I turn people on to veganism all the time. And when I think that what I do as one person, and I think, if you had, there are other people who are doing this in different parts of the world. They're some of them I know, some of them I don't know. I'll hear about some things, I'll hear about, there's actually a group of people in Iran, and there's a group of people in Turkey, and there's a group of, there's people all over the place. And they're using this approach, and they're finding it successful. If we had a movement that did this, it's mind-boggling as to what we could do. If everybody who's a vegan right now turned one other person on to veganism in the next year, and then everybody who's vegan the next year did it the following year, and then the following year, we'd have a vegan world in like 15, 16 years. Because it would just be
Does that take into account population growth?
Yeah, it does.
All
It
right.
does, yeah. I mean, we're talking about a fairly short period of time. Now, it ain't going to happen, but it could happen.
It could.
That's the thing, it could happen. And so I think that I mean, as I say, I go back to it again. I'm a practical person. I'm not, yes, I'm an academic, but I'm a practical person, and this is the only thing that's going to work. The only way you do this is you're going to shift the paradigm. It's got to be in the direction of veganism. Nothing else will work.
Mm.
And so that's why I say, it's like, people say, well, but isn't it a good idea to spend some time on this campaign or that campaign? I said, you know what? I think you have to look at it as this may be your last day on earth. You don't know what's going to happen. You could, how do you want to spend your last day? Do you want to spend your last day, with some nonsense welfare reform or nonsense, single issue campaign, or do you want to try to turn people on to veganism? And for me, the answer is clear. I'll spend time talking to people about veganism.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to mention two things and ask a question as well. When you say, for example, at the moment we don't really have a vegan movement, we have like a welfarist movement. From my experience, I've been an activist for around 7 or 8 years, and I would say at least 6, if not 7 of it was very strictly within the grassroots movement, so on the streets doing education and things like that. And now, as after founding the Middle East Vegan Society to raise awareness in the region, I'm coming across the welfarist spaces as well, let's say. And I'm realizing that there is actually a vegan movement, but it's the grassroots ones. There's thousands of activists out there that are doing the work that should be done as like a clear vegan message. It's not about welfare, not about anything else. I feel that the problem we have is that the vegan movement per se exists, but it doesn't have enough power or numbers to get things done in the
It's not
way.
organized.
Yeah, yeah. And the problem is, I think when they do want to become organized, and I do believe the movement needs funding to get things done in a faster manner, then they're gonna have to turn to donors who would usually not fund, usually, of course, usually not fund abolitionist stuff because they want to see impact earlier. So my question was about single issue campaigns, and I wanted to ask, do you think there's any place for single issue campaigns? Or is it like a yes, 100% yes, 100% no, or sometimes?
No,
No.
no. And when I wrote Rain Without Thunder, I had a whole chapter on this. And in many ways, I wish I never wrote that chapter because it's been really misunderstood. But if you had single issue campaigns that were explicitly abolitionist, that is, I mean, Tom, this was something that Tom and I worked on, this idea that a single issue campaign, if it is explicitly removing a brick from the wall of exploitation, that was the imagery that we used, is you're taking a brick out of the wall and you're very explicit and consistent about this being a piece of the larger project. Then in theory, you could have a single issue campaign. The problem is they never, ever work that way because financially they can't. So they're not, it's not, I remember having a conversation with some people who were doing a campaign to stop carriage horses in a large city. And they wanted my support. And I said, it's a single issue campaign. And they said, well, no, we're going to do it differently. We're going to use the horses as a focus, but we're going to be talking to people about veganism and talking to people about all animal use. And we're just using the horse, but it's going to be an abolitionist. Didn't work out that way. Didn't work out that way because, this is the problem. Once you're depending on money, the money is not going to, you're not going to get money. I mean, how much money do you need? I mean, it's one of the things that's great is we have the internet now. So like you're wherever you are and I'm wherever I am, and we're talking to each other thousands of miles away. And the opportunity costs of communication have gone down dramatically with the internet. So we can actually communicate with people. We can do things. and I'm going to be starting I used to do a podcast. I'm going to be starting one up again, and we're going to be making some short films and stuff like that. And I don't think you need a lot of money to do really solid activism.
Mm.
I really don't. I mean, what you need money for is if you don't want to. I mean, problem is people don't want to have. They want to have this as their job.
Mm.
And then once you're doing that, you're talking about, well, my salary, and then I need an assistant, and I need a car, and I need this, and I need that, and I need, and then pretty soon you're talking about a lot of change. I've known people, and I'm just thinking about different places I've been in the world where I've run into people. I remember some years ago being in Valencia in Spain, and I was giving a bunch of lectures at the university. Unbeknownst to me, there was an abolitionist group in Valencia, and I went. They'd have market every week, and these people would show up, and they would have small samples of food that they financed themselves. It wasn't expensive stuff. They made some vegan food, and they handed out samples. And they talked to people about veganism. It was just great. It was like, this is activism. This gets people focused. But they had jobs. They didn't have. They weren't depending on the movement for money. This is the problem. Once you become a careerist, once it's like your job, I've never seen that go well. Never. Not once. Not once. Not once. I mean, every single time it gets formalized and people start, I remember many years ago, I used to get offers all the time to become general counsel of animal groups. I had a number of offers over the years. And I always said the same thing to all these people. Absolutely not. Because once I'm your employee, I can't call the shots as I see them anymore. And I'll call the shot. I want to call the shots as I see them. The only way I can do that is to be independent from you. Yeah. So I've always basically, I've been a law professor, and I get a check from universities. I get paid by university. That's my job. The stuff that I do for animals that I do, that's what I do. That's what I do. As my I don't want to say hobby, because it's much more of a hobby, but much more than a hobby, but it's not something that I make money doing. And as a matter of fact, I mean, I finance everything I do. I basically finance, myself. Now, I'm fortunate to have a decent income, and I can do that. But problem is that I found over the years that, I watched a lot of really good people start groups that went real bad real quickly. I mean, I could write a second volume of Rain Without Thunder, and people would really be angry with me. But I mean, I watched people start groups, and I would have discussions with. They would tell me, "Oh no, we're going to be different. We're going to be different." And I would say, "No. Once you start with the money, with the fundraising, you're dead. It's over with." And every single time, it proved to be the case. And I think the whole fundraising thing is. I remember once there used to be something in the States. I don't even know if it goes. I don't think it happens anymore. But it used to be called the Summit for the Animals, and it was a meeting that used to happen every year. The heads of the groups, the corporate elite, would get together, and they would talk about animal issues. And so I was actually asked to come and give a talk, because it was at a time when PETA was starting with the "I'd rather go naked than wear fur" stuff, and I was opposing that. And so I was trying to explain that, sexism is not, you shouldn't be using sexism to fight speciesism. And so I was asked to come and give the talk, and to give a talk to the Summit for the Animals. And I got there early. It was that year it happened in Boston. And so I went to the meeting to just see what these people were talking about. And they had a whole morning focused on whether or not you got a larger per envelope contribution if you had an animal suffering story, or if you had an animal victory story. So if there's this big discussion about, do you get more money if you're sending out a solicitation that's got some horror story, or do you get more money if you send out something that says, "We've got a victory"?
Yeah.
And And I remember like listening to this thinking, I'd rather be dead than deal with it. I would I would just rather be dead than spend my time worrying about what I should be putting in the envelope to get a higher per individual contribution. And I also remember I gave my talk about sexism and animal rights, and I remember the chair of that year was the guy who's dead now. His name was Cleveland Amory, and he was sort of the grandfather of the American movement. And he had started a group called Fun for Animals. He wasn't a vegan or a vegetarian for that matter.
Wow.
No, a lot of them weren't.
Mm.
Cleveland was an interesting guy in certain ways, but I gave my talk, and Cleveland said, it's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. He said, that's like saying that the animal movement has a position on Palestinians. And I said, well, we should have a position on Palestinians as well. I said, this is all related. This is all related. You cannot segment this stuff off. Victimization, oppression, discrimination, it's all objectification, it's all the same. It's a question of whether you do it with humans, whether you do it with non-humans, whether you do it with women, whether you do it with Palestinians, whether you do it with whoever the hell you do it with. It's all related. So I'm not suggesting that, animal people have to stop doing their animal work and go and do, Palestinian rights demonstrations. It's that our position ought to be that, things like the Palestinian genocide it's a really bad idea. And we ought not to be, we ought to say that. We have to be clear about that. So that, but I mean, that's been, my experience in the movement is that, they don't want to ever get into this sort of stuff. They want to keep it pretty pristine. And talk about like, do I put a suffering animal or a happy animal on the envelope to get more money? And it's like, oh man, it's like what? I mean, I would never do that. I couldn't do that work. I mean, I found it repulsive to sit and listen to it for a half an hour. I mean, I can't imagine doing it every day of my life, was, sitting there trying to figure out how to make more money off of animals. I just think it's a really, really bad idea. And as I said, I've never seen it go well. I've never seen, been a number of people have started groups and said, we're going to do this right, and then in 5 years, they're working for the Humane Society of the United States. They've really sold out, and it's a sad comment. But
Yeah.
I really believe strongly, if we had a vegan movement, and I'm talking about like, if we had an organized vegan movement where for example, you could easily organize actions against corporations to sort of get them to produce more vegans. I mean, you can change markets, and people say, well, but that's not really changing the morality. And the answer is yes, it is. Yes, it is changing, because it's the problem is not the supply. The problem is the demand. And if you could start affecting the demand, then that makes the numbers go down.
Yeah.
And that people's thinking. We could do an enormous amount. I mean, one of the things I'm going to spend time doing in the next couple of years is trying to sort of figure out things that vegan activists can do that are basically cheap, that are not expensive to do, but things that, but they require some organization. I mean, this is the other problem, is that we live in an age of instant gratification, what I call instant activism. So it's like, you don't have to worry about knowing anything. Show up, put on a Guy Fawkes mask, and hold a laptop, and show people Slaughterhouse videos. I mean, that's a whole other problem, because I used to show students Slaughterhouse videos when years ago, and I stopped doing it because it always got the same reaction. People used to get upset about it, and then their initial reaction was, how do we make this better? How do we stop how do we make it more humane? The answer, I don't want to push them in that direction. I want them to say, it doesn't matter how humane it is. Even if it was, I don't even know what humane means in that context, but even if it were humane, it would be wrong. That's what, so I think that, right now we're in a situation where you've got these organizations like Direct Action Everywhere and Anonymous with Voices and stuff. And it's like, you don't need to know it. Show up, put on a t-shirt, put on a branded t-shirt, because it's all branding. Put on a branded t-shirt, hold a candle, or go into the restaurant saying it's not food, it's violence, or some crap like that. And and it's theater. It's theater, and it's more about raising money for these organizations than it is anything else. And the one thing I can tell you is, going into a restaurant where people are eating animal products and starting to yell at them, that may make you feel good, but it does nothing. It creates a tremendous alienation, tremendous hostility, and you don't educate people when they're eating. I go to if I'm invited to a non-vegan, if I'm invited to an event that's not going to be vegan, people say, well, do you go to? Yeah, the answer is yes. I go to non-vegan events because people will talk to me and I'll get a chance to talk to educate them. But the reality is that a lot of this stuff that these people are doing, like open rescues and stuff like that. I mean, that can't be the modus operandi of a movement, because you go in and you take a few animals out. First of all, they replace those animals, and that's not a strategy. That's not a strategy. And particularly when you take the animals out and you say, look how badly they're being abused, because the reaction to that is, well, we ought to stop that. We ought to stop them from doing that. But that doesn't get people to focus on veganism. That gets people to focus on improving welfare. And so I think, the thinking, there's an inherent tension set in the movement between effective, changing the world, shifting the paradigm, and the economic realities of the movement. And these are businesses, and as long as they're businesses, you're going to see this counterproductive nonsense. It's not going to really make a hell of a lot of a hell of a lot of difference.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a few points that I want to talk about there on corporate outreach and slaughterhouse footage. But before that, I wanted to quickly go back to single issue campaigns. The reason why I asked if there's any place for it is because I actually personally believe that there is sometimes a place for it, but it depends on the context. And I would assume that there's one thing that I see every Monday on your Facebook page. I would personally categorize it, if I could, as a single issue, which is every Monday you share the kill list in the shelters, I believe. Is it just in the New York area?
Every day I share them.
Okay, all right, sorry. Every day. So that's something, because like, hey, this is happening right now. If you could save these animals, please adopt or foster. You're not really encouraging speciesism by doing that. You're just saying, like, right now this is happening. If you can, please do it. But also, you still keep your abolitionist raising awareness efforts. You're not like replacing them with that. And personally, I think that in some cases that can actually be useful, as long as it's still accompanied with abolitionist message as well.
Well, first of all, yeah, it is accompanied by an abolitionist message, which is unique in the sense that most of these single issue campaigns aren't. But secondly, not really a single issue campaign. A single issue campaign is one that focuses on some practice and wants to make it more humane, or focuses on some practice and says that practice is worse than other practices and it ought to stop. I'm not doing either with respect to the kill list. I'm just posting the kill list saying these are animals that are going to be killed. If we have an obligation to help, domesticated animals, any that we can, and however many we can.
Yeah.
And so if you can help. Yeah. I'm not suggesting that they make animal exploitation more humane. A single issue campaigns is not just, a single issue campaign does one of two things. It either focuses on some practice and says this practice is worse than other practices, so it ought to stop, or it tries to make some practice more humane.
What about a third option where it's like this practice is unethical and therefore it should stop? Like, we should abolish this specific practice.
Well, the problem is that to the extent that you're saying that this particular practice is somehow different from other practices, that's the problem. The problem is single issue campaigns generally tend, I can't think of anyone that is different from this, that single issue campaigns are focused on some practice that is viewed as, that is characterized as being worse than completely
Another
analogous
one.
similar practices. And so in a sense, I mean, so the kill, publishing the kill list, I don't view as a single issue campaign. Because it doesn't fit the model of either. It's not either of those sorts of things. Number one. Number two, I'm always talking about abolition, so there's never any question as to
Yes.
what it is. You know, I mean, there's no problem understanding the context in which I say anything,
Yeah.
because the context is always clear.
Mm.
And so you know, so it's not, it really, there, but I've had other, it's interesting that you said that, because I've had other people ask me if that's a single issue campaign, and I never really understood why they thought it was a single issue campaign, because it's not. You know, single issue campaigns are they are a particular species of campaign. They either you know, it's like you know, the Japanese are bad because they beat up dolphins at Tai Chi, which is, you know, which is worse than what we do in rodeos, circuses, and zoos and things like that.
Yeah.
Or it's let's make, you know, let's you know, force the carriage horse drivers to take the horses off the street when it's more than 90 degrees, you know, sort of a welfare thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, but
If I remember correctly, I don't remember what was the name of the article. It might be the one you mentioned earlier, where after I think it was the, if I'm not mistaken, the one that you wrote after Tom Reagan passed away, about the story of the movement and how you fell apart. I believe at one point you mentioned kind of a lockdown kind of takeover. Was it an animal experimentation lab where you were doing, like, you were sitting inside to
yeah.
block the entry? Maybe you can give the details. Was that at the time, do you categorize that as a single issue campaign, and how do you currently feel about what that was?
Okay. Yeah, that was in the 1980s. It was the first major campaign I did. That's how I met Reagan. I was teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, and somebody had gone into the medical school and had illegally removed videotapes showing these baboons having these really horrible experiments done to them. And we got copies of the videotapes were distributed, and I represented a group of people who occupied a government building that was funding this stuff. We had an illegal occupation for 4 days, and I was the lawyer representing the demonstrators. Yeah, that was I mean, it's been an evolution. I mean, it's like, you know, it when I first got involved in the 1980s, I spent most of my time focused on vivisection, which is in many ways the stupidest sort of thing you can spend your time on, because using animals in experiments is the one use that we make of them that isn't transparently frivolous. I don't believe it can be morally justified, but I mean, at least there's something to talk about there. You know, I mean, they were arguing that the experiments that they were doing were important to help people who had head injuries and brain injuries and stuff like that. And I was arguing it was nonsense, and they were, you know, the science was really bad and whatnot. But the bottom line is that there was something to talk about. Whereas there's no justification for eating animals or wearing animals or using them in entertainment. And so it was a historical accident that when I first got involved with this, I got involved in PETA.
Yeah.
And PETA was focused on vivisection through much of the 1980s. That was their main, I mean, you know, they started doing some other stuff, but basically the first 5-6 years, I was doing nothing but vivisection. Was that a single issue campaign? Yes, it was. and you know, you know, and I think I would I do that again? No, I wouldn't do that again.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a single issue campaign. Absolutely. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, and so what if you see an opportunity? What if, let's assume again, like a hypothetical situation, what if you realize there is this one specific campaign taking place against animal experimentation, and if enough of us join, we can make it illegal, and then even use the logic we use to make it illegal to extend that application to all animal exploitation. Would you go for that?
Well, the problem is it's a zero-sum game. I mean, it's a, you know, it's a zero-sum game. any time that you spend, any resource that you spend on something is by definition you're not spending on something else. I can't imagine. I mean, would I spend my time on stopping some sort of animal testing?
Mm.
And the answer is no, because they're going to continue to breed those animals. They're going to use them for different purposes anyway. So they may not use them for X purpose, but they'll use them for Y purpose, because these are huge corporations that are just producing zillions of animals. So the fact they stop using them for one thing doesn't mean that you're going to you stop something because shifted to another use. My view is that it's a zero-sum game, and my view is that if it's my last day on earth, I'm going to spend my time talking about veganism. And so, we can come up with hypotheticals about, but if I spend time, could I possibly do something in this respect? And the answer is, yeah, but my view is that whatever time I'm spending working on that campaign, I can spend on vegan education, and I'll get a bunch of people to go vegan, and that will have, in my judgment, a better effect than stopping some sort of, or modifying some sort of use or something, which is really not going to have make a lot of difference in terms of overall. I mean, my view on this is that until you stop eating them, nothing changes. As long as you're eating them, nothing changes. Once you stop eating, I mean, veganism is more than a diet.
Yeah.
But I focus on eating as the primary thing, because the bottom line is, my experience is, once you recognize you shouldn't be eating them, your world changes. Until you stop eating, until you recognize that eating them is a problem, nothing changes.
Yeah.
So, and that's why, I've done a lot of things in my life when I sort of look back and I think, well, this was not really a great idea. For example, I used to speak at a lot of anti-hunting things, and there's no difference between people who go in the woods and hunt and people who go to the store and buy the animal in the store. And so, I remember one was a television crew there. It was actually, turns out, not far from where I live now, but it was a long time ago, and I was living in New York City, and I was close to where I am right now. And I came down to do a talk. I'm in Pennsylvania right now. And I came down to do a talk, an anti-hunting talk. And I remember there was a news station there, and they said, well, why don't you just be honest about your position? You're a vegan, so you don't think people should go hunting, but you don't think they should go to the store and buy. I said, I'm not hiding anything. I absolutely think there's no difference, and nobody should be going to the store and buying them, and nobody should be going into the woods and hunting them. And the animal people who had asked me to come and speak, I thought they were going to kill me. They were very angry, and they said, "Why did you say that? This is an anti-hunting demonstration." I said, "Because." I said, "Doesn't make any sense." I said, what's happening is you have an anti-hunting campaign. People are sitting there listening to you. And because you're not saying they ought not to be eating animals at all, they're saying, oh, yeah, hunting is a really terrible thing. But, I go to the store and I buy them. And maybe they, and what's the difference? In fact, they probably have better lives if they're, the ones in the woods have better lives than the ones who are in factory farms. And so therefore you don't really change anything. And so this is the problem. The problem is you really got to sort of get to people on the fundamental eating question, and you got to get them to see. And no matter how humanely you treat them, you ain't going to treat them humanely anyway, because they're property. But it doesn't matter. That's not the point. The point is, we can live healthy lives without killing.
Yeah.
If we can live healthy lives without killing, why are we doing it? And nobody's got a good answer to that. I mean, you get these nonsense answers. Well, I like the taste. Oh, fine, you like the taste, but you're always going to get thoughtless idiots to give you answers like that. But most people who sort of like confront that will sort of think, and you stimulate them. You get them to think, and so my view is what I find, the hook I find is, people are opposed to unnecessary suffering on animals. People react very, very strongly when they perceive that there's some imposition of suffering and death that can't be morally justified. And so my function in life is to sort of get them to see that that's basically all animal use.
Yeah.
And that's what I do, and you'd be surprised. I mean, it's I keep doing it because I get emails every week from people who were in audiences that I talked to 3 years ago. This stuff happens all the time where like I got an email yesterday from some guy who was in some talk that I gave at a university 3-4 years ago. And he said, and this is very common, I get this a lot. He said, when I heard you, you made me angry because I disagreed with you, but I couldn't figure out why. And now I'm vegan. I got 2 people on my Facebook page today to say, just want to let you know that, my sister and I went vegan, blah, blah, blah. I get a lot of response. I get a lot of good responses. So my view is I keep doing it, because I think it works. I do think it works. I think that, and I sort of try to hit it from a, most people subscribe to spiritual traditions which value nonviolence on some level. And so what I try to get them to see is like, if you're killing, how the hell can you judge? I mean, how can that make sense to you? And and then it's basically, it's also a lot of just simple education. It's stuff like, a lot of people think that it's expensive to be a vegan because what they think veganism is you got to go and you got to buy,
Burgers and cheese.
Boca burgers or tofurkey or that sort of stuff. And I told them, no, I don't eat that stuff. First of all, I don't eat fake meat and stuff like that because it makes me, I find it very unappealing. But also it's got a lot of salt and it's not nutritionally good for you. And so like I always say to them, it's not hard and it's not expensive. It's cheap, and we have a website called howdoigovegan.com.
Yeah.
And that website's got like a ton of like cheap, easy recipes where you can feed a family of 5, or 6 or whatever for a few dollars, because it's cheap. I mean, you buy lentils, you buy beans, you buy, rice and stuff like that. You can make like, with spices, and, spices is just all you need is spices. You get spices, you get rice, you get beans, you get lentils and stuff like that. You can have a really fantastic dinner and it costs you nothing. And so, and I love, that sort of stuff, the ethnic foods, like the, Indian food, Ethiopian food is just,
amazing.
it's unbelievably good,
Yes.
And you can make that, you can make in Indonesia, you can make Ethiopian food very cheaply, very, very, very cheaply. And you can even make the bread. I mean, I've even played with the Anera breads and stuff. You can make, that's not a big deal. And so it's, you can, it's one of the things you have to do is to get people to see that it's not expensive. They don't have to eat, prepared, processed vegan foods all the time. They don't have to do that. But anyway.
All right. Thank you. So my next question is, you mentioned corporate changes such as like advocating for businesses to make more plant-based products. So when we talk about corporate outreach, like reaching out to businesses and say like, hey, have you thought about adding this option here to give more plant-based options to your consumers? What do you think about that kind of work, working directly with businesses in the food and beverages industry to make it easier on consumers to go with the right choice?
Well, yeah, I mean, the only issue that I have is we don't really need those corporations now for all intents and purposes. I mean, in other words, being a vegan, fruits, vegetables, grains, beans, seeds, whatever. I'm not sure like I'm not a big fan of, for example, and I've had huge arguments with people about, when Burger King has a supposedly vegan burger that they, or the chicken McNuggets when
It's
they're
not even
frying.
vegan, it's vegetarian. It's only the patty
Well,
that's
exactly.
vegan.
Well, I wouldn't even say it's vegetarian because they're frying the plant products in oil that's got animal fat in it. And I had a huge argument a few weeks ago, it was probably more a few months ago, with the reducitarian people and some of some of the supporters of the reducitarian thing, because they were all upset with me because I said people shouldn't be going to burger or whatever, Kentucky Fried Chicken or whatever, and eating the chicken McNuggets or whatever company was frying something in oil that had been used to fry animal stuff. And they said, well, that's just trace. I said, no, it's not trace. You got animal fat in there, and the animal fat is being used to cook the plant products. That's animal fat. That ain't that's it's not like a knife that was used or something, or that there's something on the surface of the kitchen, that whatever. You're talking about significant, you're talking about ingredients. And so I'm just not a big fan of trying to sort of like, work with McDonald's to have them, I don't really want to say, I mean, one of the problems with some of these things is, it used to be the case that, when a bunch of teenagers went on a Friday night, if Mary or Johnny was a vegan, and everyone would accommodate that, and they'd go to a vegan place and they'd all eat vegan. Well, now, McDonald's has, these vegan or supposedly vegan things, which aren't vegan. And so now everybody can go to McDonald's.
Yeah.
And so we're now driving people to these horrible corporations that are responsible for killing zillions of animals, destroying the rainforest, and creating all sorts of havoc. And so it's I mean, I think there are things that one of the things, like something that could be done that actually I've been thinking about is, it's really appalling, these airlines. You order a vegan meal, and 95% of the time there's something on the tray that isn't vegan.
Yes.
And it upsets me because I end up like writing these letters to British Airways saying, look, if I were Jewish and I had asked for a kosher meal and you put shellfish on my plate, it would upset me. But you wouldn't do that because you respect my kosher views. You just don't respect my vegan views.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. And I think that, I would not be opposed to sort of getting people together to tell these airlines, when people order vegan meals, you take it seriously, because that has the effect. That's not a single issue campaign, because you're not pointing something out saying, you're not saying we don't want you to serve foie gras, but you can serve steak. We're not doing that. We're not saying, we want you to serve more humanely produced meat. We're saying you got to take veganism seriously. I'm all in favor of that stuff, because that's got an impact. That's got an impact both on individual people, but it's also got a social impact, because you're sort of encouraging people to think seriously about veganism. I mean, I saw something the other day. I don't know if it's true. If it's true, it's shocking. But I read something, I don't remember whether it was in the Guardian or the Independent or something, that in Britain, 3 out of 5 products had, of vegan products had animal ingredients. Well, if that's true,
That's very concerning.
It's very concerning. I mean, I actually don't eat a whole lot of processed foods. First of all, they're not good for you. But you always have to be careful, because it's like they say it's vegan, but you don't know.
Exactly.
And so you have to be careful about that. But when I saw that, I mean, I need to look into that further, because it's on my list of things that I have to research it. But I saw just a headline, it was something like 2 out of 5 or 3 out of 5. It was an alarming number of, like, it wasn't like 1 out of 73. It was like, it was, 3 out of 5.
That's a big number
of vegan foods. Vegan food is not vegan.
Yeah.
And so that concerns me. So that's the sort of thing that I think, we need to get companies to take veganism seriously. And that means you don't tell people that something's vegan when it's not. My recollection about the British situation was that there was no definition of veganism, which sort of surprises me, because veganism started in Britain, and you would think that that would not be particularly difficult thing to
understand.
In Britain, but
all right. I have 2 more questions.
Okay.
One of them is one of those areas where I think I would have a disagreement, is the use of slaughterhouse footage. So I have done a lot of activism with the use of slaughterhouse footage along an abolitionist message that I share. And that eventually switched to giving lectures in universities and schools on animal ethics. And for a long time, I used slaughterhouse footage, and I always collect anonymous feedback from my lectures. And so I ask individuals how they identified before, how they thought about, anyway, like a bunch of questions to see their stances before and after, and what is useful to them or affecting them or not. And I very specifically, after showing the slaughterhouse footage, at least in the lecture, have a whole section on why there is no better way of doing this. It's like no matter what way you come up with is immoral because of the explanation that animals matter. So this year I gave a bunch of lectures as well again. And this time my lecture was very different because it was more based on philosophy. And I didn't use slaughterhouse footage. And I did feel that it actually did not impact, it didn't create this, let's say, anger in people to want to become better people. I had so many, I still had like very positive feedback. So people, it was very like logic based, the lecture, like about logic and philosophy and things like that. And so people still gave me positive feedback, but I felt like this sense of wanting to get active now to make things end, like this horrible trust to end, was not as strong as when slaughterhouse footage was used. And I realized that actually, even if we go back in history when they were advocating against the slavery, actually wanting to abolish slavery, one of the strongest waves that they had is when one of the first images came out of African slave who had been whipped, so his back shows. And obviously that was used in advocacy, and it was used in abolitionist advocacy, and it helped them so much. And I immediately thought, well, that makes sense. Like I see the same in people. Like when people see slaughterhouse footage, yes, there is a chance that they think this is horrible, we should treat them better when we're killing them. But if it's accompanied with a message and asking the questions like, hey, can we really do it in a better way? Let's explore why no better way is moral. Then I feel that is actually not a welfarist thing to do. It's quite effective as well sometimes.
Well, I think there are several things I would say. One is, to the extent that you're saying this can't be done in a better way, remember that there are people who have a larger microphone than yours because they've got more money.
Yeah.
They're telling people, no, you can do it in a better way, and we can, this could be done more humanely. So you have, you're saying what you're saying, but then you've got Compassion in World Farming, which is this mega monster organization, basically saying, oh no, you can do this in a better way. And you even have some organizations that, saying, well, we should have CCTV cameras and slaughterhouses. Like, what the hell is that going to do? And they think it's going to be live streamed on television or something. But I think that message gets diluted. And also I think I remember when I was first doing this work in the 80s with vivisection, the first stuff that we did had a real big impact. And then the more you did, people get saturated with violent imagery. Particularly now, young people are like watching violent imagery all the time. I mean, they play these computer games all the time. They're watching violent movies all the time. I don't know that you really. My experiences, again, your experience may be different. My experience has been that you can get an initial reaction of people saying, "Oh, this is really horrible. I don't want to participate in it anymore at all." But my experience has been over the years that basically what you end up with is people who think that at least as an interim matter, you ought to try to make it better. And that's been my problem. My problem always has been that you can get, there's no doubt that I would show, Anna and I would show, because we would show the students some slaughterhouse footage, and they would be upset. And then 2 weeks later, you know, because we've got the follow-up because they're students for the entire semester, and 2 weeks later they're saying, well, I contacted such and such an organization, and they've got a campaign to sort of do this differently.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. The problem
Yeah.
is I think, the clean way to do this is to sort of get people to say, look, even if it was done beautifully, which is not
Exactly.
done,
Yeah.
even if it was done, the point is, why would you kill when you don't have to?
Yeah.
Even if it's done humanely, and getting people to focus on that, because once you get them to understand the moral issue there, then you get behavioral change. I think it's very difficult. My own experience is it's difficult to get behavioral change if it's just visceral, if it's just people responding to gory movies,
Okay.
to gory imagery. I mean, you know, uh, there can be things that can be life-changing, like we used to go to there was a pigeon shoot that we used to go up and I used to we used to represent people. The animal activists would run onto the field and they would grab injured pigeons and stuff like that, and I would represent them because they'd get arrested. And those things are horrible events. I mean, they're very brutal events. And I remember I would take students up there, and sometimes those things had a really profound effect. As a matter of fact, I stopped doing it because the students were getting emotionally really upset. I mean, they were seeing this stuff, like psychologically being adversely affected by it. It's like taking them to a real slaughterhouse as
Yeah.
opposed to letting them watch a movie, you know. And you take somebody to a real slaughterhouse and it has a profound effect on them. And but I think the movies, I mean, the problem is that we're living at a time when you can go to Netflix and watch stuff that's horrible. I mean, really violent stuff, really violent, bloody, horrible stuff. And so there's still this sense in which, when they're just watching it on a movie, in a film, in a video format, that the emotional response of being grossed out is not dissimilar from what they get if they're watching a horror movie on Netflix or Amazon Prime or something like that. But it's not clear to me that that it has a real behavioral impact. Which and what I found over the years was that when I stopped doing the gory movies, and I basically said, what I want us to focus on is a simple moral question. You can't do it humanely, but assuming you could, would it be okay? Is it okay to go up to this cow and kill this cow? Even if you do it painlessly, is it okay? And if it's okay, why is it okay? And if it's not okay, why is it not okay? And and you get them to go through those steps.
The thought process.
You can get, I mean, that's the problem. The thing is, what you're trying to do with this is you're trying to undo thousands of years of species of anthropocentric thinking. And it ain't easy, because we're sort of hardwired with this. I mean, we all think that this is normal. We all think that this, I mean, it's really quite remarkable. It's stunning, actually. We kill more animals for food every year than the total number of human beings who have ever lived on the planet since we crawled out of the swamp. I mean, every year we're killing more animals than the total number of human beings who have ever lived throughout history. That's mind-boggling. And that has become normal for us. I mean, it's like, well, we don't think about, I mean, that's a profoundly disturbing fact. And so one of the, so that's why, I mean, it's not that I like, that I have like a sort of that I think people who show slaughterhouse movies are evil or anything like that. It's just, I just don't think that stuff works. I think ultimately, what you're doing is, you're showing them, Saw, or one of these horror films, which they'll turn away from, because they're gross, but it's still a movie, it's still a film, it's still, I just don't think it has that it's sustained change.
All right. Okay. So my last question before we finish it is, well, my second to last question. I've been using a type of, let's say, a thought process with a question that I learned while watching a few videos online. It's called the name the trait question, which is usually useful in just discussions in general. It doesn't necessarily have to be with animal rights, but it goes like this: let's name the trait that is true of other animals, that if true of a human would justify treating a human in the same way as a commodity. And so people start naming traits like IQ level, and then you take that in a hypothetical situation. If someone has a lower IQ level than you, does it justify to treat them as a commodity? No, it doesn't. Therefore, this cannot be the trait. And so you go over the list of all the traits that people can name, whether it's physical or cognitive or any type of mental or emotional, and then you apply it to a human, and no one would agree that we should use
Right.
a human as a commodity. What do you think about that line of questioning?
I've been doing that for decades.
All
I
right.
mean,
Okay.
I don't do it that, I don't do it quite that way, but I mean,
Yeah.
it's like what I'm always saying is, look, if you've got a human, if a human is a person in these circumstances, in what circumstance would you say that the human is no longer a person and no longer
Yeah.
has a more interest in, and so, you always get these things like, what about IQ, and what about this, and what about that, and what about this? You say, okay, fine. Is IQ relevant? Yeah, it is relevant. I mean, if you're going to hire a mathematician in the
Yes.
university, and you got a choice between somebody who's mentally disabled and somebody who's a great mathematician, they're not similarly situated for the purpose of who gets the job teaching mathematics. So therefore, you may discriminate against them because they're not similarly situated. But if the question is, who do you use as a non-consenting subject in a biomedical experiment or in a painful experiment or in some other situation, the person who's mentally disabled or the person who's a brilliant mathematician, the answer is you shouldn't use either of them.
Yeah.
Because those characteristics are irrelevant for that question.
Yeah.
But no, that's fine. I think that, analogies. Look, I'm a big fan of analogies. I mean, I love it. I spent my life making analogies, and so I'm always trying to get people to see that what I'd like them to see with animals, they already see in situations that are not distinguishable involving humans, and it also, that sort of approach also gets people, like when like you can get people to sort of acknowledge, they say, look, I really think that there's a difference between humans and non-humans. I think humans matter more. Well, why? Well, because they, and the problem is we have, almost everybody subscribes to religions that has, that are anthropocentric and whatnot. And but what I always do is, I always try to bring people back and say, well, look, you know what? Even if you're going to choose the human over the non-human in any situation of true conflict, because the human's got a soul and the non-human doesn't, if that's what you believe, that still doesn't answer the question about whether or not it's all right to impose suffering on the animal where there's no compulsion. I mean, like if you have some religious belief that says humans have souls and non-humans don't, and you're going by the burning house, and you can only save the human or the non-human, and you decide to save the human because the human has a soul, okay, fine. If that's what you believe, that's fine. But that's a situation where there's a compulsion and you have to make a choice. When you're figuring out what you're going to eat tonight for dinner, there's no compulsion. You're just, I mean, it's like, there's no conflict between you and the cow or you and the chicken, or the, and so yeah, no, I'm a big believer in making analogies. That's fine with me.
What really surprises me with Peter Singer's work is that he mentions the argument for marginal cases in, I believe, in Animal Liberation, and I can't understand how someone who can use that argument cannot also make that argument to grant other animals basic moral rights.
Well, but when he uses that analogy about marginal cases, he's using that in a couple of ways. What he doesn't think that being a marginal human is relevant to suffering, but he does think that it's relevant to the value of life. I mean, he says that. He says that in Animal Liberation. He says that cognitive deficiencies are not relevant to people suffering, but they are relevant to the quality of life and whether or not that person has an interest in life. So he's saying that. And then he's also saying, well, we shouldn't do something to a an animal that we wouldn't do to a similarly situated human. But the problem is that that sounds great, but it's nonsense, because we never see humans as similarly situated to non-humans, because we always see them as having more value.
Yeah, that's true. All right. So my last question to you is actually the question I ask all guests, and the podcast is called Principles of Change. So I ask everyone who's here as a guest, what are your core principles that make you fight for a change in this world?
And the core principles that make me fight,
Like values and beliefs that you hold that make you want to actually like fight for positive change in this world.
non-violence. I believe that I have a violent reaction to violence. I think violence is really bad. And to the extent that I identify with any spiritual tradition, it's Jainism. I believe very strongly in nonviolence. I think it is the ultimate, in many ways, the ultimate moral and spiritual truth. But yeah, nonviolence is, and also, there's a wonderful thing that happens, like we have where we live, we have foxes and we have deer and stuff like that. And the foxes, they love the vegan kibble because all of our dogs are vegan. So I bring them out kibble all the time, and the foxes come up and they get very, very close to me, and I give them vegan kibble, and I buy apples for the deer, and I cut them up and I take the seeds out because they have cyanide in them, and I cut them up for the deer, and the deer get very close to me, and it's like, you realize there's a whole world out there of non-humans that you can have kinship with and that you could have relationships with, but we have this hostile, it's like it's killing and aggression and stuff. And I actually get an enormous amount. I mean, we live with 5 dogs. As a matter of fact, one of them is here. He's blind and deaf. We took him because the breeder was going to kill him, was going to drown him, because nobody wanted to buy him because he's blind. I love this thing. I mean, I get so much. I get such value from my relationships with animals. And that's a great byproduct of what I do. But I do it because I believe that I believe very, very strongly in nonviolence, and I'm from the generation. I mean, I'm an old hippie. I believe in love. I believe in peace, love, and rock and roll. And I do, and I really do believe in in nonviolence and peace and love. I think those are very, very important values. I've never stopped believing them, and I never will stop believing them. And I mean, the sad thing is I really do believe we could have made a difference in the world. The movement could have made a difference in the world. The movement has chosen not to, because the movement is a business. And I'm not an idiot. I mean, I realize that once when I was in Europe, I think it was the Spain trip that I mentioned before. I'm pretty sure it was that. I've been to Spain a bunch of times, but and somebody asked me whether I thought that ultimately I was going to see a vegan world, and I said I had no idea, and probably not. And she said, "Why do you keep doing it?" And we were walking in the square, and they were selling little statues of Don Quixote, the man, the Don Quixote, and I picked up a Don Quixote statue, and I said, "You're Spanish, the story of Don Quixote." And the whole point of Don Quixote is he tilts at windmills, and he knows on one level that they're windmills, but he it's not a question of whether you win or lose. It's a question of like doing the right thing. You got to get up every day. It's like I get up every day. What am I going to do? I mean, it's like I'm not going to sort of say, well, I'm not going to do it because I'm not going to win.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm going to do it because if I can finish tonight and turn one other person on to veganism, as far as I'm concerned, that's great. It's a victory.
Yeah.
And is it gonna change the world? Nah. But is it going to change the world in a little way? And the answer is yeah. And can it change the perspective and turn somebody on to what I've been turned on to with this. I remember once saying to Tom Reagan, how fortunate I felt. I remember saying to him that I didn't view this as that I saw myself as lucky. I felt lucky that I had figured this out.
Yeah.
And I felt fortunate and I felt grateful that I had worked this out. And I felt really sort of privileged that I had sort of figured this out, because I don't really have a whole lot of moral confusion. The
Yeah.
issues that plague most people are sort of things that, I've worked
Don't
that
bother
stuff
you.
out. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me. And and so, but I think the benefits, I there's a thing that goes around. It shows up on my page a lot because I have a bunch of volunteers and they make little posters, and they're very good at that stuff. And they take quotes from me and they turn them into little posters. And one of them is, I don't view veganism as a sacrifice. I view it as a joy. And I really mean
Yeah.
that. I mean,
Yeah.
that's not,
I've seen that poster.
and I mean, and I really feel that. To
Mm.
me, it's great joy. It's a great joy. It's for me, it has been, when people say to me, but you can't eat this, you can't, I said, I don't look at it that way. It's not a question of I can't eat it. I choose not to, because it's not who I am. And so I don't view, and I said, they said, do you think, is it a sacrifice? I said, I never had a right to it in the first place. How the hell can I sacrifice if I don't have a right to it in the first place? And so, I view it as a great thing. And I love being a vegan. This is my 42nd year of being. In October of this year, it will be,
Wow.
wait, is it, wait, 40, no, 82. So this will be 41. This will
Yeah.
be October this year, October of 2023 will be 41 years I have been a vegan. And I'm happy with it, man. I'm happy with it. I mean, and it's like, I didn't do it for health reasons, but I got to tell you, I'm the only person I know in my age group. I don't take, like, I mean, knock on wood. I don't have I don't have health issues I have to
Yeah.
deal with. I didn't do it for health reasons. But I mean, I'm pushing 70. I got more energy than most of the kids I teach, who are like young enough to be my grandchildren.
Yeah.
And I've got, I sleep 4 or 5 hours a night. I'm very, very active. I feel great. I feel better in many ways than I felt when I was, like, in my early 20s and I was still eating meat and dairy
Mm.
and, I mean, I feel much better.
Yeah.
So to me, I didn't do it for health reasons. Don't
Yeah.
get me wrong.
It's an extra.
For health reasons. Yeah.
Yeah.
But hey, I feel great. I could drop dead tomorrow, but you know what? I'll feel great until the time that I go, because I feel I don't really. It's amazing. I just had a birthday and I thought, wow, I can't believe I'm this old, and it's like, I don't feel this old. And so, yeah, anyway, well, thank you very much for having
Amazing.
me.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
It was
stay
a
in touch. Stay
pleasure.
in touch with me. Yes, stay in touch with me. It's been great. I love
Yes.
talking. And you're doing, you're in an interesting part of the world. There's probably a lot of stuff that you can do that, but just keep doing it.
Yeah.
And stay in touch with me, okay?
Yes, will do. Thank you so much.